effective in terms of heating. You know, there's a movement now with like the passive house, which is making houses so tight that they don't even really want that much solar gain because that window reduces their ability to insulate the space. But classically, traditionally, the best light for an artist was northern light, you know, non-direct, no big bright glare. So daylight, you know, can happen through a northern skylight or a northern window, and the ambient light is still going to light your space pretty well during the day. And by no means would an eave like this, you know, make it dark in here. It just means you're not getting any direct solar gain. You're not getting those like, rays of sun that you can see on the floor. They would be beyond your space, but you'd still get light coming in your windows. Right?
So there's no material that would let the light shine through but not the heat?
Well, that's a lot of our low-E glass windows are designed for that purpose. They're designed to block UV and designed to minimize the amount of solar gain coming through windows, which is the one risk of using salvaged windows and doors in greenhouses, is that most windows and doors are being designed with like furniture fading as like one of their selling point, like resistant to like UV rays so that furniture doesn't fade. Is much more important to them than whether you're going to get like the full spectrum of light for ripening tomatoes or lemons or limes or figs. And there's a lot of, as we, you know, we can grow things behind glass and even under plastic, but that's the frontier of the whole material science of glazing options, is really studying the light spectrum and looking at like what we want to exclude, include. And for horticultural purposes, for greenhouse growing, we're getting at totally different conclusions than for like, you know, for energy efficiency for houses and for not fading furniture, etc. So, great. So, yeah. I'm going to skip some stuff about basic passive solar house design because this is a greenhouse class. And we're going to jump right to the potential of, well, okay, I guess I need to just do really basic. Your optimal ratio is approximately twice as wide from east to west as it is deep from north to south. That doesn't mean to say every building needs to be this shape exactly, but your optimal ratio is approximately that, like a broader face to the long day of sun during the winter, and deep enough, shallow enough in terms of depth that winter sun still reaches to the back of the space. That's your kind of optimal proportion, right? And then in passive solar house design, essentially you want to think about like where your primary solar real estate is and what buildings, what rooms in a building you want to be in during the day, where you want daylighting, where you want passive solar heat. So if your kitchen is a common one, if your living room or dining room, or if you're working at your office at home during the day, those are the spaces you want to have daylit. Those are the spaces you want to have warmed. And then beyond that, you can think about how we want to buffer ourselves from northern energies, like the coldest prevailing winds in the winter. So closets hanging with a bunch of empty, you know, space coats on hooks and bookshelves from a passive solar optimum are all like, you have basically you're adding another 3 feet of essentially low performance cellulose insulation if you're putting all your bookshelves and your closets on the northern walls, right? And you know, and then another thing would be to think about concentrating water so that you're not having to heat the whole space above freezing every single day of the year, or else your pipes are bursting. And having, you know, bathroom water, shower, washing machine, kitchen water, sink, dishwasher, all grouped more tightly so that if you go away for 2 weeks during the winter, you can leave a thermostatic heater near your water system at like 40 degrees and not have to keep your whole house to 70 degrees to keep all your pipes running through your exterior walls and stuff from freezing, right? So then in broader, you know, there's also, as a pattern that's emerged in cold landscapes, has been a porch to the north where you can hang out during the summer. And a pattern that's emerged in this region where we heat with wood is that you hang out in that porch during summer months and chill when it's cool and you don't want to be in the sun. And then as the days start getting cooler, you start filling that porch with firewood, and then you have less space to hang out once it's winter, but you have your firewood protected where you don't need to put on boots or a coat or anything else to go out there and get it to stoke your wood stove, right? So I'll bring that in because some cool space is critical for passive solar cooling, and we'll talk about that. Then, if we're looking at, producing food and having wastewater treatment systems or integrating with ecology and biology more directly, there's the potential for a greenhouse to the south. So that's a kind of archetype or archetypical passive solar house with a greenhouse attached. A cool space to the north, longer east to west than north to south, and the greenhouse to the south. Typically, as a rule of thumb, if we look at that, sector diagram again, our greenhouses are best faced due south, with the broad face facing due south. It always depends on your site, and like Dave Leduc was saying, is that you can build a greenhouse on the north side of the house and you can still grow some plants. In fact, it might even be better for certain plants that don't want as direct light and heat, right? You can do with what you have. You can do anything. You can put a greenhouse on the west wall, you can put a greenhouse on the east wall, but our optimal from a passive solar standpoint is long access east-west, due south. If you had to compromise between southeast or southwest, passive solar design would suggest that we look slightly to the east, but again, it depends. If you've got a giant mountain here and you're not getting any sun, and your sun is nice and long here, then it would make sense to put your greenhouse west of south, right? But one reason why in an optimum east of south is preferable to west of south is if we think about days, temperatures, they're coolest in the morning after night, and you want to invite that solar warming in as soon as possible to your systems, right? Then if you think about sunset in the western sun, your ambient temperatures are already at their highest, and that's in Feng Shui they call that late afternoon western sun, they call the dragon sun. And depending if you're trying to grow some tropical plants and you want a hot greenhouse, great, but for comfort and performance in a house attached greenhouse, and if anybody's ever seen these houses, they're built with like all of the glass facing the sunset at the west. And like, has anybody been in a house like that where it's like all glass to the west, like facing this beautiful sunset? And what you see as a pattern is like huge giant shades that are always drawn over that big sunset because it's so hot and it's a not very comfortable light. When ambient temperatures are already at their maximum and then you get solar gain, it tends to put you over the top in terms of comfort. But that's general. And that's not to say this is the only way to build greenhouses. These are passive solar principles. If you're doing production greenhouses for summer crops, they are typically oriented north-south long access because then as that high summer sun comes over, you get the most even light between your rows, right? Whereas if you're doing east-west, every greenhouse is casting a shadow behind it and you're not getting as even light distribution. So for summer production, and you go and you'll see a lot of greenhouses that are cranking cucumbers or melons or tomatoes or peppers. Typically those will be like gutter connect north-south like this. But a passive solar or winter producing greenhouse is going to be oriented with the longer face facing the day of sun. So, questions about those then? Okay. So, I think what I'll do is I'll just diagram some ventilation schemes, and then we'll take a break before we look at some slides of some of this. So, here's that house that we were just talking about. Here's its window or its wall. Now, if we wanted to attach a greenhouse to this house, here's the ground. Maybe that's our ground outside, our foundation. We could do any number of things. But let's say we're going to build a greenhouse like this in the south wall. Now, sun's shining in the greenhouse, what happens inside? Gets warm, right? and the hot air
Goes up.
rises,
Okay.
right? So if it's winter, where do you want that hot air? You want it, right? You want it in your house. So basic passive solar design principles suggest that you have a vent as high as possible in your greenhouse to allow the hot air from your greenhouse into your living quarters, into your space. Okay? Now, what happens when hot air evacuates is basically a vacuum. That air needs to be replaced. And if you don't intentionalize where that air is replaced from, it's literally going to start pulling in cold air like through the cracks in the glass and plastic. So you want to have an intentional replacement. In a theoretical optimum, that vent is as low as possible in your house, in your greenhouse, so that all of that cold air that is settled via thermal stratification into the bottom of your house is being sucked back into the greenhouse where it's heated and pushed back through your house. And so you get this convective loop, which during the day, and this is a critical, qualifier, during the day is heating the air and replacing the air in your house, replacing the cold air in your house with hotter air, right? Nighttime comes, what's happening to that air? It's getting cold, and it is nothing. It's not being heated. So you need to be able to shut these vents, totally. And then your house is just your house. We'll look at some pictures of people with greenhouses connected to their houses where they're just living like in their greenhouses. And depending on where you are in the world and climate, it's certainly beautiful. But this far north and in a cold climate, for performance, your wall against your greenhouse should be built as an exterior wall, as fully insulated as any wall of your house is, right? And you may have a door or a window so you can still appreciate that view into your greenhouse, or even, get that winter, summer sun that you want still coming into your masonry stove for thermal mass or whatever. But this is a wall that's able to be shut down like you would shut any wall down to the world outside, because the greenhouse is going to get cooler, right? It's by nature of being a greenhouse, it's going to lose heat to the atmosphere much more rapidly than your house would. And if these vents were left open, it would cool your house. So summer happens, sun shines in the greenhouse, air still gets hot, gets even hotter, right? And air hotter still rises. So our theoretical optimum is to keep hot air evacuating to the atmosphere before it gets into our house, and to have a vent as high as is feasible to the exterior inside your greenhouse. This vent, however, still functions the same, yet you want to be very intentional about its source, where that cool replacement air for your greenhouse is coming from. And in some designs, you'll see if you have something like a shade porch or a firewood porch or just a big closet to the north of your house that's cool air, you can have a vent here that draws that cold air from your shade porch through your house and evacuates it through the greenhouse, constantly bringing cold air into your house. In David Holmgren's passive solar greenhouse design, his house is built on skids, and there's a crawl space like 3 feet beneath. And he has vents in his floor during the summer months that are where all this cool air down here is what is being drawn as replacement air as his greenhouse is evacuating. Rather than having the greenhouse pulling atmospheric air, which is pretty warm, he's bringing that cold air through his whole house, and that's where he's replacing the air that's evacuated his greenhouse via venting.
If you had a basement, would that be a good place?
A basement is definitely possible. One thing with basements, of course, is being wary of humidity. But if anything, during summer months, having that cool air actively brought up into your space is actually going to
passes through the basement.
It would actually probably prevent rotten mold from happening in your basement, because you'd have a constant draw of air. And we'll look at some other ways that people have used basements. And then, of course, in winter, when you're doing that circulating loop, these need to be able to be as closed as they would, as an insulated wall. So questions about that in principle? Obviously, it's an optimal and idealized. And again, it's not to say every greenhouse needs to have this, but in basic principle, we want to have hot air evacuation to the atmosphere as high as possible in the greenhouse during the summer. And if it's attached, we want to have hot air evacuation to where we want it in the winter, right? And then the most important thing is that we pay really careful attention to where we're replacing that ventilated air from. And this is the biggest detail that's often overlooked, and it's why a lot of these greenhouses end up being salvaged, is because the ventilation systems and the movement, the thermodynamics of convective air currents aren't considered. And these are the principles in their simplest. Obviously, there's a million different ways they can take shape. Anna Edie, who Dave mentioned a little earlier, is a woman whose house burned down, and she just set out to design and build her own house. And she spent like 7 years. First, she went to a bunch of architects who basically said, oh, you know, you can't really do that. She spent about 7 years researching stuff and came up with her own design. And one of the things that she was looking at is what's called a trome wall. And a trome wall, or trombe, it might even be properly pronounced. That's how it's spelled. But in English, we typically call them trome walls. And they're a classic French passive solar technique, which is basically a few inches of space between glass or plastic and a dark black wall. And you'll see actually for sale these little micro trome walls that are basically like solar heat collectors that vent into your window. And you put them out, you know, in your front yard, and they just put hot air. You crack your window a couple inches, and they put hot air like pouring into your window during the day. What happens in a trome wall is obviously, you know, you get really hot temperatures when you have just a few inches of space between glass and black, and that creates an aggressive thermodynamic current, right? Where hot air is rising quickly because it's so hot. So what she did in her greenhouse was she actually did her entire roof as a trome wall, a few inches. She basically built a 2-inch deep greenhouse over the entire south roof of her house. What happens there is that air gets heated even hotter than in her greenhouse. So in the summer months, the vent of her greenhouse is into that trome wall where it's getting even hotter, and thus constantly has a very aggressive updraft out to the atmosphere. And she has like almost like a sugar shack cupola, little ridge vent along the peak of her greenhouse. During the winter, she has a fan here, an active fan, and the greenhouse is still vented up through the trome wall, getting heated, in some cases, you know, 110, even 120 degrees. You put a roof, you know, an inch of plastic over a black roof. And that fan is running, and in the case of her house, she's filling gravel beds in her basement. She fills and stores that heat in these gravel beds in her basement so that during the night, that heat hotter rises and just radiates up through her house. It worked well enough for her house that she did the same thing for a commercial greenhouse where she had essentially a trome wall above the glazing that vented to the atmosphere, and during the winter she pumped not into gravel beds but into the growing beds, into the soil that her plants were growing in all winter long, which was an interesting application because plants can grow with warm roots in warm soil and cool air temperatures a lot more easily than they can grow in warm air temperatures with cold roots and cold soil, right?
Where was this located?
This was in Martha's Vineyard, was her original house and greenhouse, and she sold them both to go, you know, she works as a designer now all over the world.
What's her name?
Anna Edie. Yeah.
If you're putting the trome wall on the commercial greenhouse, isn't that going to block out some of your?
So you can kind of see, I sort of tried to draw it, but basically it's like this huge, like, kind of peaked arch, and like all of this is clear, and then there's like a thermal accelerator near the ridge. And then the other thing, you know, she has is a division wall, which is full of thermal mass, which all her plants are to the south of, and to the north is full of animals as another heat source. Yeah, so any questions about this stuff in terms of basic thermodynamics? We'll look at some examples. It might make more sense when we start seeing some photos of it, but it seems like you folks are pretty well on it.
Regarding the tram wall, we also tried, but because of the vent on both top and bottom, and also dusty atmosphere, so lots of dust gets between the wall, black painted wall, then that gets dusty and just covered with dust. So
Yeah.
how do you like?
That's a great question. I mean, I would have a lot of control in terms of what air is coming in there, and if I could, even filter that air, or make it easy to sweep out or clean. But I've never worked firsthand with one of these systems. I just portray it as an application of these principles to the nth degree. It's kind of the next. It was her going even further with this idea. But the basic idea that all you really need to understand is you want to pay attention to the movement of air in your greenhouse. And not to say you never use fans, and fans in some greenhouses are essential, critical, but insofar as is possible with any greenhouse, we want to have our systems based in passive, if only to save energy and make it that much easier, that many less moving parts that need to be replaced. You know, if your power goes out with a blackout because everybody's running their air conditioners because it's a heat wave, and your greenhouse doesn't work because the fans aren't spinning during a heat wave, you know, you really want to have some redundancy in your ventilation. And not to say you'd never use fans, but we always want to put passive, we want to have preference for passive. We always want to have consideration of like natural air movement and then augment it if necessary with moving fans. Another just little thing to add though is things like this fan here, or any greenhouse active ventilation, is kind of one of our optimal places we can use solar energy without the limitations of solar energy. I love solar energy, I love solar panels, but the limiting factor of solar energy is how we store it. And right now, that is lead acid batteries, the same technology we're using in the 1890s, right? And that's, if you want to have lights at night, or if you want to use that power when the sun's not shining for anything, you need to have it stored in some way. But if you can use solar energy directly to do work, then you bypass much of the expense and the parts that are quickest to need to be replaced. So, for instance, in this example, this solar panel can be hardwired to a fan, and all that's going to happen is the brighter the sun is shining, the faster that fan is going to spin. A cloud comes over the sun, and that fan's going to go, and then the sun comes back out and goes, and starts venting better. And it's immediately, you know, managed by the amount of sun that's coming in. Another thing is like a water pump to a water tower or something. You don't need inverters, you don't need batteries, you don't need pump. You know, just if you had a DC pump, solar power is pumping that water up, then the storage is simply the potential energy comes from gravity, and you don't need to store that energy. But that's kind of a whole other topic. But I think, you know, the potential for direct solar ventilation of greenhouses is large, because I've done it with water pumps, and we've done a couple different experiments with this. We took those $19 solar panels that are sold for you to like plug into your cigarette lighter and keep your car battery optimum, and we cut the car battery charger off, and we plugged it to a fan with a positive and a negative, and that fan just spun like crazy when the sun would shine. You put your hands in front of it, and it was, and then we did the same thing with a water pump and a display, and like within 5 minutes, all the kids that were seeing this little display at this fair learned that like you could stand in front of it, and the waterfall that we had built like would slow down or stop, and they'd be like, "Come here," to their friends, like, "Come check out the waterfall," and they'd stand in front of the solar panel, and then they'd jump aside, and the pump would kick back on and like spray like 10 feet beyond the waterfall and like totally soak their friends. So kids learn this stuff pretty quick. But if there aren't any other questions specifically to this, I think we'll take a short break, and then we'll come back to look at some images of how this is applied in the real, or not applied, as the case may be. Great. Welcome back, folks. Yeah, any questions from that other stuff before we move on a little bit?
Do you have an example of what materials would be used for venting? Like
materials for venting, like,
You're gonna vent from the front of your house under a porch to the back. What would the conduit look like?
that's a great question. So really anything, I mean, it could be like a chamber in wood. The biggest challenge in terms of materials is to close it and keep it insulated, which unfortunately very few things perform as well as foam in that application. But as far as like the movement of air itself, like really anything could do. I mean, some people would use like, you know, metal ductwork or like round metal dryer tubes.
And it can be just simply open, for instance, in a basement situation, just simply open to the basement.
Right.
It doesn't have to actually be a pathway of sorts, a concentrated airway, in other words.
Okay.
Unless you're trying to specifically get it from another room
Through
the
a room
system,
you don't
through
want
a
it,
room you
yeah.
don't want. Then you would just like duct.
But typically like the vents that I was just describing are just like doors, you know, that you open to free the movement of air, and then you close at night. And you can have them wired to a thermostat where certain temperatures open and close vents automatically, which if you're, you know, going away or not wanting to like make it a part of your morning routine to like open your vents when the sun comes up and close your vents when the sun goes down, you know, thermostatic venting is a really great technology that we have, or timers. But typically people are, you know, opening them in the morning and closing them at night by hand. So yeah, so I just wanted to throw in some of these to continue the conversation about the history of greenhouses. These are pictures of gardens in Paris during, you know, the late 1800s, and this was what's known as the French intensive system, which at the time was one of the most productive agricultural systems in the world. And the city of Paris was so productive that they were exporting produce to the surrounding countryside, because the city was where horses were stable, because this was at a time when the entire world economy was essentially horse-powered, or at least all transportation by land was horse-powered. And these are what's called a cloche, which is basically a glass jar with an open bottom, and they were put individually over each separate plant. And when the sun, you think like opening the greenhouse vents in the morning is a chore, these folks would come on a sunny, warm day and prop every single cloche up onto a stick, because if they were left closed, it would get too hot inside. And then if it was going to be cold that night, they would unroll straw mats on top of every single cloche, right? And they were also using what's, you know, a cold frame, which is just a bed in a window. And these are the real winter production is the cold frames, because those are where French intensive really had its edge, was the basically the manure, live compost heated growing systems. But it's still one of the most intensive and productive agricultural systems there is. And in terms of real estate, you know, the real estate was so valuable. You can see, you know, there's no room for even a cart, right? So everything was harvested by hand into baskets that people wore. And the only vehicle access was with permanent rail tracks in many of these farms, where they would have their carts on rails and their water tanks on rails and their harvest baskets on rails, so that they had permanent dedicated space. It was the only space that wheels could roll, because otherwise every square inch was in production.
And no one was out of a job.
And no one was out of a job. Yeah, it was lucrative, as you can see by, well, it was lucrative for some. It certainly was a force of employment. So I just throw that in there as a little historical background. But what's that? Yeah. So here's another way of graphically representing those numbers that we were just looking at earlier. So this is a chart that's generated by a website called sunpositions.info, which is one of my favored but there's tons. And there's a new one that's, I'll have to email it to you guys because I can't remember the name of the website, but it's basically like a USGS sun finder where it pulls up a Google map and it does those lines of winter sunrise, solstice, sunrise and sunset, summer sunrise, solstice, sunrise and sunset, you know, on like plan view, like the sector diagram, from any given point that you want to pinpoint on a map. But these are how we chart it, and this is, if you imagine, you know, you're looking due south, and the paper itself is your degrees azimuth, so it would like wrap around you, and you see that 90 degrees true east isn't even on this map, and true west, 270, isn't even on this map, and the winter sun is going, you know, just skimming over the ground, hitting its maximum height at solar noon at 22 degrees altitude. Now, look at summer in the same location, and you get a better sense of where east and west are, right? And now, of course, the sun is rising way north of east, going totally overhead to almost 69 degrees altitude, and then setting way north of west. Again, as if this was kind of wrapped around you. So, does that make sense as far as those types of diagrams? And they usually come with a table where you can also look at what the numbers actually were. One of the reasons that these are great tools is because, say for instance, you could use them to unending precision in your greenhouse design. So for instance, you could position the thermal mass in your greenhouse, your masonry stove, your concrete countertop, precisely so that in the fall, maybe 3 weeks before you'd normally ever fire up your masonry stove, or a month or 6 weeks before you'd ever actually light a fire in it, that masonry stove just starts then, you know, say like first week of September or last week of August even, to start getting some of that solar gain when the nights start getting cooler. And then, you know, by the time it's winter, it's fully in there. But you could also position it so that, you know, in the spring you start getting, you know, that thermal mass, and using that thermal mass heat a few weeks after your heating season and a few weeks before. If you really, I mean, you could really get incredibly precise to the minute of the day that you wanted to start getting solar gain on an element in your system. So here's just some kind of schematics from the, you know, the sort of basic principles of integrating all these different elements. This is the plan view, the overhead view, and there's a cross section of a house-attached greenhouse bathhouse. There's a small bathtub. The stone wall is positioned, and the solid roof is positioned such that the winter sun is getting all the way in and basking that stone in light, but the summer sun is totally excluded from all of your living space, and it's only on your plants in the front of the greenhouse with more near perpendicular glass, right? And the bathtub itself is a source of heat for the greenhouse, all the hot water, and then as it's drained, it's used as irrigation in the greenhouse, and as a source of thermal mass. It's absorbing the sun during the day and releasing it at night, and then overflowing to a gray water system. Here's a picture of me taking a shower in my greenhouse. Just kidding, obviously. But this is what sold me on the whole idea of this completely. You know, to be showering and watering the plants in your greenhouse with no energy other than taking a shower that day as you graze upon the grapes that are your shower curtain. You know?
How do the opaque glass walls affect, do they affect it at all, or no?
You know, opaque, I think it's just for the privacy of the shower.
Right. Would it affect the sun or the heat?
Certain opacity is actually, we'll probably get into that a little bit more when we look at glazing, but certain opacity, you don't want to actually have pure, clear glazing, because pure, clear glazing, well, I shouldn't say you don't want to have, but it's another one of these cost benefits depending on your goals. If you want to have the beautiful view, you're going to need to have like clear glazing, right? But from a plant growing perspective, clear glass is going to make for direct light, harsher light, and sharper shadows. Whereas if you have somewhat opaque light, like a greenhouse plastic, which you can't actually see through, scatters the rays of the sun and it makes for more even distribution of light and makes for much less hard shadow in a greenhouse. So depending on the opacity, I wouldn't think it's really a problem. And you know, you can always have plant shower curtains. So this is some of the early designs of John Todd and the New Alchemy Institute, but just to show some of these principles, thermal mass is employed in brick. All of the raised beds in this greenhouse are built out of brick for purposes of bringing thermal mass and having mass to make the temperatures a little bit more resilient to change. And then water tanks, tons of hundreds, thousands of gallons of water in tanks as thermal mass. In this case, also stacked and functions as an aquaculture system. And then using vertical space, they have plants on pulley risers so that they could pull things up and move things down and get them all the way to the top, and basically make use of all that vertical space. And then the other element in this system is adjustable louvers, which excludes summer sun and opens to include winter sun. So this is a greenhouse in Huntington, Vermont at the Teal Farm, which is a site that I did a big design for, and Dave worked on this greenhouse, right? Yeah, Dave built this greenhouse, so it's a beautiful glass. Is that Lord and Burnham?
That's totally scratch built.
Scratch built,
Yeah.
nice. So here we go, this is Dave Leduc's work, a beautiful greenhouse on a renovated farmhouse. And one of the things about this greenhouse that I really like to share is the venting system, which is, if you look, this is the south wall of the house, and you can see that these two windows are right here above the greenhouse, but under the headers and in the frame of those windows are vents that are into the master bedroom at the very ridge of the greenhouse. So in the winter daytime, you can open those vents, and it's almost like a heat register. I mean, it's not quite a wind, but it's like it would raise a little, like what do you call those feathers on a sailboat? They're really sensitive to little flicks in the, a ribbon. It would flick a ribbon with how much heat is coming because heat's rising.
So, question about this: the roof of the greenhouse taps right into that exterior wall, and it vents through the bottom of those windows?
Well, the windows are separate. It's just in the same framing, so basically they're the same width of the window, but they're totally different vents. They're not, the windows themselves are finished above and flashed above. Yeah. And what we're not seeing in this picture, which is which was taken not long after this greenhouse was built, is that now there's like kiwis and deciduous vines on it, so that in the summer it's not in as direct of light.
That bottom row, that's also functional vents to the out of doors. And
Yeah.
inside the floor system, up against the wall, they have probably 2-inch thick glass louvers that open into the basement, which is that whole air circulation that Keith was referencing before about cooling the whole cycle through the house. So these registers just open automatically, but you can stand on top of them because they're so thick of glass. It's pretty wild. An exorbitant amount of money went into design and build. That's all cypress, antique cypress. The siding, the greenhouse, all milled. A lot of the logs came from dredging in the Carolinas. They're bringing up old cypress logs that have sunk for 150 years and mill it. And some of that's from old silos, using cypress in silos. So we basically gave them a design for the extrusion, and they milled all the parts I needed, and then I just scratch built the greenhouse on site. So all their insulation in the building is recycled blue jeans. I mean, the money, it's incredible. They got $60,000 just in the hardware for the doors and hinges inside the house.
Now they're selling.
It's for sale.
In-house for sale. And they had plans for a huge range of greenhouses. They have all the infrastructure in place, all the water, all the everything. And now it's
Yeah.
Is that the one with the wetland also attached to it, like the massive masonry stoves?
they flew in the turbine that night on the helicopter illegally and set it on the mountain.
Oh God, for real?
For real.
Green wall. What's the asking price?
Oh, it's huge.
15
It's-
million or something
I
like
think
that?
Is it down to 15 million?
That is,
Down to 11.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Down to 11. Yeah, I've got a Kickstarter campaign. If you want to buy
It's a
Teal
beautiful
Farm.
site. It's
It
not,
is.
That's just a corner of it. The barn that they built is, you've been there, right? You've seen that barn. It's
Yeah.
just fascinating.
I'm
And
actually
just to the
still-
right side
still
of this
working
photo
through it.
is Camel's Hump also,
What's that?
right? Just to the right side, I mean, out of the right edge of this photo is Camel's Hump.
No, that is Camel's Hump. It's just not as up. You can
Oh,
still
that's
actually see
I
it
think that's Ball Hill.
right here. That's Camel's Hump
there
right
it is,
there. But anyway, a cool greenhouse. Yeah, cool masonry stoves. Masonry stoves themselves are, yeah. So this is Buzz Furter's house here in Worcester, and this was a photo taken in January. And this is the south wall of his house, a polycarbonate attached greenhouse. One thing before we go inside, you see there's a door over there, up there. Anybody want to guess why?
Knocking the snow off.
He very well may use the door for that, but I don't think he put it there just for that purpose.
Is there a good tan on the top of that?
He may also very well may use it for that, but I don't think he put it in there for that purpose. It's not a functional part of the greenhouse ventilation. So,
Sledding.
what's that? Sledding. It's also something he may use it for, but so why that door was framed there is because, so this is the south wall of the house. So what happens in the winter is he gets all this sun deep into his house, right? What happens in the summer is he gets all this sun still fully through his greenhouse. And if he feels like that's too much, he can and or will put a deck out off of this wall, going over the greenhouse, the length and depth of the deck being decided by exactly what point he wants that eave to fall, the eave that we were talking about. So he can set that deck if he wants, basically he can use that deck so that in the summer months when when the sun is high, his wall of the house itself that he's living in on the inside will still be a massive coolth and will be in shade, but the front of the greenhouse can still be getting direct solar gain. I don't know if he's going to do that. He hasn't been overwhelming himself with heat during the summer months, as far as I know. But that, as far as I understand, is the reason that door was there, so that he could shade the overhead sun during the summer months, if and when he chose to. So, what's that?
Sorry, I'm just making. I feel bad. I keep saying, oh, cool. I'm like,
Okay, yeah, no, if you have questions, just let me know. So we'll step inside, same day that we had those, January, right? And here we see that Buzz has achieved full self-sufficiency for cocktail lemons and limes, right? Now, here's another one of those cost-benefit balance points that it's probably worth mentioning, which is the other thing you see when you're looking at that greenhouse is a stovepipe, right? This is a wood-heated greenhouse, and if you're trying to ripen fruit in Vermont, you're not going to be able to do it without supplemental heat. A passive solar greenhouse can grow a lot of food, and we'll look at other ways of growing food through the winter in unheated greenhouses. But if you want to ripen fruit like tomatoes and lemons and limes, you need to heat. You need to add heat. And Buzz's house is very efficient. That said, he probably uses more wood heating his greenhouse than he does his entire house. In the back, against that east wall, we see a giant feed trough, which is where all the wastewater in his house goes. So every time he washes his dishes, every time he takes a shower, every time, they do the laundry, all that wastewater is going through this tank. And the residual heat from that water is being kept in his greenhouse, and he can use that water to water plants in his greenhouse. I should say this is a dated photograph, and that Buzz's greenhouse is now since undergone and is currently undergoing a total redesign. And Chris is working on it with Dave.
He's got a constructed wetland for his gray water now, and that tank is going to serve as, it's about 1,000 gallons, and we're going to fill it up to about 800 gallons and set up an aquaponic system where he's going to heat the water to around 75 degrees year round and use that as thermal mass to kind of have heat come off that. And
so instead of wood firing his greenhouse,
right.
he'll heat the water, which is necessary for the fish he wants to grow, and then the heat loss of that heated water, in theory, is the only heat source for his greenhouse. So here we'll look a little more closely. On that tank we see a dense colony of water hyacinth, and this is something, he also has cherry tomatoes going, again, in the winter. Something I think needs to be said, while we're going to be looking at a lot of ways that people use gray water in greenhouses, I think it's very important to note that gray water completely stinks, and that's the fact. It's septic. It smells really bad. In the case of Buzz's greenhouse, this colony of water hyacinth is so thoroughly colonized the surface of the water, there's literally like a scum on the top, which makes it so that unless you go and disturb that water tank, it doesn't smell septic. It's not like overwhelming, like it's not really even unpleasant, or wasn't. But you could smell septic. There was a faint odor of stale gray water, of anaerobic digestion, which is one of the reasons why I think he's redesigned his system.
Yeah, we had to clean out that tank, and I can certainly vouch for the smell.
Yeah. But but that's one way of mitigating that problem, is having that colony of plants. And that colony of plants isn't just for show, and the colony of plants isn't actually what's doing the nutrient uptake from his wastewater, as much as where those plants are functioning is, as aquatic plants, their niche in ecology is to be able to bring oxygen down underwater in their roots. And that supports aerobic communities of bacteria that are really doing the uptake of nutrients in the system. So the plants are more of a substrate for these diverse microecologies that are really doing the work of water cleaning. So this is one I did with the Wild Branch Farm in North Wolcott. And what we're looking at here is pretty much a conventional high tunnel, but it's not such a good photo, but what you can see is, the entire north wall is earth burn, completely buried underground, 8 feet high, and just the sides as well. And that's something that these types of greenhouses aren't designed to withstand. You can't just pile dirt on top of the north wall. It's a gunite cement cave built inside of the greenhouse. And that's done because one among many products of the Wild Branch Farm is mushrooms. And they do a lot of production of oyster mushrooms. And I wish I had some more recent photos, because this was taken pretty much just after we finished. But right now, this is inside the cave on the bottom right. And wall to wall, edge to edge is bags of mushrooms fruiting. And they fruit through the winter in the slightly warmer ambient temperatures found by being inside of the greenhouse. But they also don't want to be in as light-soaked situations as the greenhouse would normally be. Further, the mass of the gunite cement cave is an incredible thermal mass for that greenhouse, which maintains a much warmer, stable temperature for the plant production, which is taking place through the other 3/4 of the greenhouse, and structurally provides the opportunity for backfilling and insulating both the cave and the greenhouse itself. This is a building that I built for the Tuberville farm in Colchester, and I did not do this greenhouse on the south wall. It was a site milled timber frame. We cleared the site and milled the frame out of the wood that was there. And we left the job, and we suggested that they might consider putting a greenhouse on the south wall. I probably shouldn't even have this slide in here, but since it is, why am I less enthusiastic about the way this greenhouse has been done. It might not even be that obvious in the photo, but what?
Is the roof glazed?
The roof is glazed, yeah. So that's fine if you're looking to grow like tropical plants, and if you're looking to grow, if you want to grow hot crops during the summer, obviously you need to have overhead direct light. But in a building attached greenhouse, and this is an insulated barn, it's a working office, it's animal shelter, and you're going to get wicked hot. There's no integration with the building in other than like getting potentially like 100, 110, 120 possibly inside that greenhouse with unmitigated overhead light during the summer. And that's the only, I put it, I don't know, I should just take this slide out of here because I'm not trying to be like they did it wrong, but it is a common energetic cost in greenhouses is to build them overly receptive of summer sun, especially when house attached. Because if you house attaching a greenhouse, you don't actually want to have it. You might in the front half of the greenhouse have some sun direct for solar gain for tomatoes and peppers and stuff, but you don't want to have amplified solar gain on the actual building itself. In fact, you want to moderate that or exclude it altogether.
But if you're not killing plants, you're not learning.
I guess, yeah. But if you're leaving a job and somebody else does it, then I guess you can't complain.
Can I, this is back at that slide, just
Yeah.
it has nothing to do with the greenhouse, but just curious about those returns, those big returns.
Yeah. Like why are they like that?
Yeah,
I don't know.
just curious.
Yeah, I can't remember, to be honest. I'll have to.
No big.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. It might have been just for the aesthetic that the client was after. So here's one right here in Warren, done by Chris Chason, Home Farm Services. And just to get a sense of like the mass, the whole thing is dry lake stone as a foundation, pinned to ledge. So it's like pinned to crust the earth itself, to bedrock. And then inside the greenhouse is a stone dust floor covering radiant heat loop with a laid stone floor on top. All for purposes of thermal mass, right? Then, as the greenhouse was finished, we see that this is kind of the counterpoint of that last greenhouse, right? And what you think that the goals of this style of greenhouse would have been on balance and the cost-benefit analysis? Like, what were these folks looking to optimize on the spectrum of greenhouse potentials?
Maybe a place in the wintertime to go and just sit around and keep warm.
Yeah, it's a mud room is basically what it is. So it's your entryway where you can go and you can take your snowy coat off and take your snowy boots off, and that snow is going to melt, and you're in a room that the water's not that much of a problem because it's designed to be a greenhouse. But it was primarily for passive solar. So we see that the angle of the glass is tilted closer to vertical, almost perfectly perpendicular to the 22 degrees of the winter sun. The overhead of the addition that this greenhouse represents is solid. It's solid roof. There isn't overhead light coming into the whole room. The only overhead light in the summer is into the growing beds, which are just a few feet behind the front. The front between this door and this are the growing beds, and that's where the only place in there you get light during the summer. The whole rest of the room and the wall of the actual house are sitting there mass of cool in the shade during even the summer months. Also, this planter bed is such that you could put kiwis trellised up or grapes trellised up or tall sunflowers so that in the height of summer you're also mitigating how much sun is coming in. And then this whole detail is also chosen to be like high albedo stone for winter reflection so that even the roof and back of the greenhouse itself are getting more lit during the winter months, although they're often covered in snow during the winter months, which is probably higher albedo than shiny rock. But there's a better shot of that planter bed. And velocity that glass really comes out to be. And those solar panels are running the ventilation system.
Sorry, what's the word that you used? Albino?
Albedo is like a term for the reflective quality of materials. I believe. It might be libido. So these are the greenhouses at Arco Santi. Arco Santi is a pretty interesting project in and of itself. It's Paulo Soleri's solar city that he's building in the desert of Arizona. And interestingly, there's like this whole city, and then there's like this little like shitty buildings that are the farm that feeds the city, and I don't know, that's another story. But these are totally massive, and this is a really different ecosystem, right? This is desert, and so really hot temperatures during the day, but really cold temperatures at night as well. So the mass becomes important, and the nature of that mass being somewhat reflective and absorptive in turns. This is a freestanding greenhouse. This is the guest bathroom and shower, and the banana right there is pretty much your shower curtain. And the whole thing is heated with that little dodecahedron or whatever that Dungeons and Dragons dice stove is. And then this is the main farm manager's personal greenhouse, house-attached greenhouse. You can see one of those cheap solar panels. In this case, my understanding is it's actually wired to water air pump so that the gray water is more aerobic than it would naturally be left on its own. Although it may also function in some ventilation, but I'm not certain that it does. And so their house, this is the greenhouse attached to their house, but their house is totally crouched to the north side, completely sheltered by the greenhouse. In the shade, in fact, of the greenhouse is lower than the greenhouse and is behind the greenhouse, so that they, you know, in the hot desert sun, have some shelter. And then inside the greenhouse, we see just how massive, you know, the elements are. All of the raised beds inside are poured concrete, and all of the wastewater from kitchens, showers, baths, and dishwashing in the house are filtered through those beds and stored as thermal mass at the bottom of the greenhouse, which is where they're doing some passive aeration with a direct wired solar panel to an aquarium pump. This is another one at Arco Santi. This is up on the hill in the city. But I also use this slide to talk about the potential for architectural integration. There, really, you could match almost any building style with a greenhouse in theory. Some of you may know Sarah, whose name escapes me, whose last name escapes me. She works, she's a Yestermorrow student, a former Yestermorrow student who works with the Sanctuary for Independent Media. Sanctuary for Independent Media is a church that a collective of artists purchased to use as gallery space and as studio space. And they're doing, I've been consulting with them on doing some permaculture design for their landscape around the church. And one of the things that came out in the design was the potential for passive solar heat addition to the church and a greenhouse. They had an optimal site for a greenhouse, but there was a lot of resistance within the collective because, as it is, there's a lot of people in the community that are kind of wary of a bunch of churches, a bunch of artists using a church in a non-religious way, and they want to respect the architecture at least and kind of like maintain some aesthetic. But we ended up looking further, and we found like this steel, bent Victorian steel greenhouse that looked like it was of the exact same era of the church, and looked as if it was designed with the church in its original state. And they're fundraising to try to build that greenhouse. But there's a why you can really try to. There's a why you can make them look like almost anything. Here's Anna Edie's house, and so she is a weaver. She runs a loom. Her job during the day is weaving on a loom. And so she sited her loom and office and studio in such a way that it was naturally lit and within these plants like tomatoes and nasturtiums vining around her year-round. The bathtub was in the greenhouse with its heat loss in water waste stored and managed in the greenhouse. And then we look at the, and I'll just also add that this is an example of the type of greenhouse that can't be effectively closed during winter nights, which is, which is signifying that she's in a much more mild climate than we are here. Here is her production greenhouse. I'm sorry I don't have any slides of the greenhouse itself from the outside, but what we are able to see is what she calls the water wall, which is that massive, division between the productive greenhouse of plants and the animal shelter. And they're basically double black plastic trash bags filled with water and held in between deep studs and with wire reinforcement. And they're like piled up, and those are the source of thermal mass. These black plastic trash bags are the thermal mass. One of the things she learned pretty early on in her experiments was that keeping hundreds and hundreds of chickens in a greenhouse really impacted the air quality to the point that it impacted the ability of plants to grow healthily. Ammonia is really bad for plants, and you get a lot of chickens together on bedding, and you end up with ammonia. However, ammonia is half a step from digestion for some of the most optimal plant nutrients and nitrates. And so what she devised is what she calls the earth-lung air filter, which is essentially a controlled air exchange between animal quarters and vegetable production, which it forces air through beds of mature compost and forest floor like duff, like leaves and pine needles and compost, which causes the gaseous ammonia to go through the ecological processes to make it into plant assimilable nitrates, which turned out to be a pretty critical piece in her design, and something that's important to consider if you are looking at keeping animals in your greenhouse, depending on how many you are. And then the other feature that I'll just add here is the wash tub, which is, it's mostly her greenhouse is producing salad greens, and especially during the winter, that's pretty much all they're producing is salad greens. And you got to wash salad greens to get a better price when you're selling to restaurants. And so they have this big tub there, but worst case scenario, below freezing night in the winter, you're going to have a record low. You just have to fire up the wood stove under there and have a hot tub party. So on those record-breaking low winter nights, you fire up your hot tub, you sit and have a hot tub party, and your whole entire greenhouse is heated by the hot tub and the stored heat in that water when you get out. And then maybe you change the water before you wash the salad the next day. So this is some slides of the greenhouses at the Central Rocky Mountain Permaculture Institute, which is Jerome Ostentowski's site, and he worked with John Cruikshank to design these. And essentially what we're looking at here is subterranean heat storage, which is something like I was describing earlier, although this one's a little bit more active. So what we're looking at is under the growing beds before the soil media was brought in, and basically in the ridge of the greenhouse is a thermostatic vent that once it reaches a certain temperature, a fan is turned on, and that pulls the hot air that had risen, all the hottest air in the thermostratification at the top of the greenhouse, and pumps it into this octopus of pipes below the soil that the plants are growing in, so that then they're stored there during the day, and that heat and hot air can rise during the night, and so that the hottest air that's held against the ridge of the greenhouse is also evacuated from the space in the sense of where the plants are experiencing air temperatures. On the right, we see the same situation designed for a geodesic dome. On the left, we see a schematic of the whole system, which is what this one is. This one when it was under construction, and basically he's got his house attached greenhouse, and his production greenhouse. And essentially, the production greenhouses are some of the lower temperatures, and the production greenhouse excess heat is vented to his house-attached greenhouse, where he has much more experimental plants, and he's growing bananas in high-altitude Rockies. And basically is a lot more intimate, and he hangs out in there, and there's a lot more diversity, and it's not as focused towards like production. And then the surplus heat of that is going into his house itself. And this has been finished since these photos. Here's my house. Just kidding. You know, why not? I wish it were. But, and I didn't put the slide in here originally to knock it. I think it's awesome. I think it's an awesome vision. But there's a couple things that it brings up in the conversation that I think are important. One is, again, there's no ability to close your interior space against the greenhouse during the night, during the winter, which you really don't want to actually be living in a greenhouse. You might want to be living in a greenhouse during the day in the winter, but you don't want to be living in a greenhouse during the night in the winter. And then the other thing is, I don't mean to say you can't build, you can certainly build greenhouses out of wood, but you really want to pay very careful attention to the movement of moisture and air. And condensation happens. What happens when it gets cold outside? You have all these plants evapotranspirating, basically pushing water out of their leaves. It gets really humid in a greenhouse. In those ventilation systems that I schematicked earlier, that's an asset, because typically during the winter months when you want your greenhouse air in your house is when your interior air humidity is low, and you want to have more humid air, especially if you're heating with wood. That's why people are putting open pots of water on top of wood stoves. In the summer, when you don't want to have that humidity in your house for risk of mold blooms and things like that, all of that humid greenhouse air is evacuated to the atmosphere. In this type of situation, A, you have a lot less control of where humid air is going, and B, condensation is going to settle on wooden beams. If you're going to be using wooden beams, you need to basically, my philosophy is to build the inside of a greenhouse just as you would build the outside of any house, meaning everything is flashed, meaning you should be able to run a hose in your greenhouse. And this greenhouse, you know, if I was running a hose or trying to hose down or wash the algae that might be growing on the plastic, you know, I'd be worried about the couch and the television and you know, as awesome as those things are, I think personally, it's just a personal preference, the greenhouses should be able, like your design criteria should be like, can I turn on a hose in here? Because you want to be able to spray down your walls, you want to be able to wash your glass with plastic, you want to be able to get wet, make a mess, and have everything drain and flash in a controlled and designed way, rather than having condensation, settling, landing on wood, and accelerating rot. I don't know, Dave, if you have any thoughts to add to that, but
Pretty much online.
yeah. So anyway, this is totally awesome though, and yeah, why not? Live in that, you know? I hope to. I will actually show you my house. This is my house downtown, Johnson, Vermont. And this building was, maybe I can, well, this isn't exactly what it looked like when I started. This building was built by a professional landlord to be student housing. It was never made to be a home. It's an up-down duplex, and you know, we're right downtown, and there's, you know, a couple of views of like cupolas and steeples and clock towers and stuff, but basically every window looks out onto parking lots or dumpsters. It's, you know, it's urban as Johnson, Vermont gets, but it's urban. And to the south of the house is a beautiful wooded hill that reminds us that we're in Vermont. There is, as was built, not one window on the south face of the house. Not a one. And is the only like privacy sector in the house as well. So this is what we're working with, and this is basically the south wall, as I've said. The angle's exactly perfectly opposite of what you would ideally have for a passive solar house. It's long from north to south and skinny east to west as a rectangle. But we were talking about like, okay, so the first thing we did is we said, okay, let's let's put in a sliding glass door, double wide sliding glass door, so we live in the upstairs apartment, and we're like, okay, we've got some sun coming in. It's where all the house plants end up gravitating during the winter months. It's where the cat's always sleeping. You know, it's made a big difference in our space, in our daylight, in our kitchen. But we wanted to go a little bit further, and we were talking about the potential of adding a greenhouse to it, and we just, you know, put it out there, and then we were looking through the paper, and we see in the newspaper this ad says greenhouse for sale in a warehouse. I called it up, I go there, I look at it, and it's like most of the greenhouses I build are on farms, or relatively simple. And this one is like these curved aluminum, curved glass, like a crazy high-end greenhouse I'd never worked with the likes of. It's actually the first thing I really worked with Dave LeDuc on. I called Dave up knowing he's been a greenhouse specialist for over 30 years, and I'm like, hey Dave, I got this greenhouse I'm really interested in, you know, can you, actually I guess the first thing we worked on was Red Wagon, but anyway, I knew of Dave and I was like, I need some help with this thing, like help me figure it out, is it worth me buying? Dave shows up and he's like, okay, well this is Lord & Burnham, kit number 24A, here's the instruction manual in case you want it. And I'm like, awesome. And you know, the curved glass, each piece, $200–300. The aluminum scrap metal alone, maybe $1,000, $1,200, even $1,500. And it's sitting there in a pile in the middle of this warehouse, and these guys are like backing around it with their you know, their fork dollies, yeah, well, fork dollies, but whatever. And I'm like, I'll take it, I'll give you a couple $100. And they're like, look, for a couple $100, like, you're gonna move it and load your truck, but yeah, get it out of here. And so we got it. We still haven't built it yet. This is the design concept at present, but we'll figure it out eventually. It's become sort of low priority, some of our other greenhouses on the farm, because this is our house downtown, 2 miles from the farm. But this is, in theory, what we're looking at doing, putting the greenhouse on the second floor, for one reason, because we live there, and we don't live downstairs. But more importantly, because of that hill to the south that I mentioned, the sun in the winter just gets over that hill, and we do have a full day of sun during the winter on the second floor, but as you go to the ground floor of that hill during the lowest sun and the shortest days, actually skims below the horizon. You really don't get much gain during the dead of winter. So there's one reason for us to bring it just 8 feet up over the ground. And then, you know, what I'm experimenting with here in the design is just a couple things. Also adding a gable ridge window, a gable end, you know, peak window. But what I really want to show folks is the sun angles. And, you know, if we look at the sun, we'll start here, summer, okay? So here's summer, sunrise, sun comes up, and what I want to show you guys is two things. Maybe I'll just kind of rotate the greenhouse a little bit. But here I'm kind of indicating thermal mass with this brick or stone veneer that I've drawn on the wall. But look at the shadow line. And what we see is that against the actual house that we live in, and this thermal mass, the sun never shines during the summer. It doesn't hit it, right? And this gabled peak window doesn't get sun, direct sun. I'd have tons of daylight to read, and, you know, way more daylight than my houseplants would love it, but I'm not getting actually direct solar gain. I'm not getting like harsh rays of the sun coming into space at all. But the front half of the greenhouse is totally getting sun, so we can have those plants, you know, that we need sun to ripen, like tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, cucumbers, lemons, limes, bananas, figs, whatever, in the front house of the greenhouse. But the mass of the building stays a mass of cool and actually keeps that temperatures from getting over the top during the summer days. Now, let's look at what this sun does during the winter. And we'll go to the winter solstice here. And here's sunrise. Boom. From the minute sun is rising, right, it is soaking that thermal mass of the wall. And all day long, that's all it does. Here at noon, and I've removed a section of roof just to the second floor. But basically, that sun will go through that gable window, you know, all the way through to the bedrooms in the back of the house. Just by adding one little window on the southern wall, it'll go all the way through to the very back of the house, and you know, soak us with direct sun only when it's cold out. And so anyway, I show that just because, you know, it's one example of some of the principles that we're looking at in terms of like where we place eaves and where we place shadows and why we look at some of those, you know, sun charts so carefully in design. And to show that like the potential for retrofit, I mean, this is a building with no consideration of passive solar design whatsoever in its construction. And it's not that much retrofit really to make it much more passive solar than it was, or at least pretty cool.
Do you own the entire building?
I do.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, like, if you're just living in the second floor, you're gonna just build a deck over the first floor.
Yeah. Oh yeah. You know, like that's. Yeah. No. And that's actually the big compromise in this one is, you know, well, what does that say for the light downstairs? And frankly, it kind of sucks. But they don't really get that much light anyway. And what they would gain is the whole space under the greenhouse is a big open porch that would have locking doors, so they could have a couch out there, they could have their bikes out there. You know, it's like it adds a lot of living space to their space, and of course they'd be welcome to come upstairs and hang out in the greenhouse, or you know, hang out in this deck, assuming our relationship with our tenants is good. It always changes. We typically have like people that we're close with, that we care with, that we share meals with, that you know are part of our family, that will watch our daughters and stuff. But if it was random students or whatever, then maybe they just get a place to lock their bikes in, you know. And they keep the curtains shut so tight anyway that it wouldn't matter. I have yet to figure out really exactly how the stairs are going to be replaced. That's you know, where that eave that we're getting things from, in terms of the you know, this shade in the gable window is because there's a 4-foot eave over this little ramp, the stairs outside. I have yet to really figure out exactly how I'll resolve that. This was just one potential schematic, but anyway, this is yet to happen. But I do have the glass, and the greenhouse is designed exactly around the arcs and size of the glass. And that's the other thing I'd like to add about that whole solar eave thing, is that the greenhouse itself is only what? Like, it was only designed to be 6.5 feet deep, right? Now, I'm going to add over 8 feet, 6 feet I guess is what I drew here, but I could go 8. And that's going to give me more than twice as much square footage inside of my greenhouse that's still going to be in the sun in the winter by just having that solid roof, what we call a bump out, you know? And you know, so I basically get twice as much greenhouse without having to spend the glass, and I still have an insulated roof, and you know, that stuff. So, questions about this design? So then, the other one I'll just show briefly is our greenhouse for my studio at the farm, and this one's also under construction, and there's a lot going on here, but in its simplest, what we see is that a greenhouse attached to the house. Again, we see solid roofing over the top for 2 reasons. One is so that snow slough off of this, because when you're building against a bearing wall, that's something you really need to keep in mind, is that the roof is going to slough snow. So this snow slough is going to land on solid metal roofing before going over my glass, which I'll probably do overhead in polycarbonate. And this roof also, again, allows me, in fact, we can do here is we can look at those 2 angles. And so this is the 69-degree angle of the summer sun, this is the 22-degree angle of the winter sun, designed so that the massive wood chip clay insulated wall between the house and the greenhouse, or the studio and the greenhouse, is basking in sunlight all winter long, and is staying a cool, massive cool in the shade all summer long. But the beds, the growing beds inside the greenhouse are still in the sun. What I've done with this greenhouse, since this drawing, these are the vaults for a large moldering toilet. I've decided to actually take the greenhouse all the way out to the moldering toilets for two reasons. One, the moldering toilets are going to perform better by being inside of the greenhouse. Two, all of that concrete of the vaults is now going to be thermal mass inside of the greenhouse instead of thermal mass just outside. And three, greenhouses are much like barns in that once you build one, you usually wish you built a bigger one. And you know, you fill them very easily with stuff and plants. And so to get another 24 square feet or whatever with a few more dollars, when I had the concrete truck come, I decided, it was pretty much like right when we were doing the form work that I decided to rearrange and make the greenhouse 8 feet larger than the building it was attached to itself. And then the only other thing I'll add is that this core is the only insulated space. This porch, roof, garage, whatever, is now actually being designed to be a living roof on top, but this is our cool air draw. So all the replacement air in the greenhouse is being taken from that super shady north side of the house. So just to see what some of those principles look like in more
do you insulate this thermal mass from outside?
Yeah.
Also?
Yeah. It's a great question. So if you have thermal mass, which side do you want your insulation on? You know, and in the case of this, what we've done here, where this drawing is misleading because this is what we built, is actually 2 inches of foam. I'd rather do 4, you know, and then backfill. So the finished grade around this greenhouse is right up to the top. You know, the finished grade is actually more like this, you know, and that's my garden beds are up in that retaining wall right around my house, and then there's a stone retaining wall with dirt between the footer of the greenhouse, the stem wall that the pit greenhouse is in.
And also bottom.
The bottom is not insulated.
Okay.
Because the whole stem wall is 4 feet deep and is wrapped in foam 4 feet, but the bottom is actually done in drain, and I used a product called Forma Drain, which is basically the footer of the wall was formed with permanent drain tiles that are left. And so basically inside and outside, I can hose down that greenhouse, and the whole thing is basically just a perfect drain, so that, you know, the other factor with my farm is we're in floodplain. And so worst case scenario, and that's also why the greenhouse is built up 4 feet, and then the insulative earth berming is built up 4 feet, is so that in worst case scenario flood, my more precious infrastructure like my greenhouse and my studio are well above those flood levels, and B, as soon as the water's down, like I've got like immediate evacuation of water in the drainage. So, yeah.
What are you using, and how does the system work to get the cool air from the north porch to the greenhouse?
I have yet to figure that out in much detail, but right now, it's not drawn, but the building is basically on, like, essentially piers, let's say. So the building itself is like 3 feet above the ground. What I may do is leave that space under the studio completely open during the summer, so that that air is free to move however it wants, and that I have like this whole mass of all the gravel and piers and everything kind of like contiguous. And then maybe I'll have like sheet foam that I'll put in the winter so that that is shut off. Just like every September, I'll come in and like totally close it off. I've yet to figure out exactly how I'm going to do it there. If anybody needs, you know, some practicum for their certificates or wants to help me figure out the real nitty-gritties of this greenhouse, it's still in progress for sure. But the concrete's been poured and all the piers are done and the building's there.
Isn't there like a problem with like in winter you have like icicles coming off from the fall?
Yeah, and that's why this whole area of roof is solid, so that they can land there. And it is a functional cupola, so that in the summer, the cupola is actually working functionally to accelerate the ventilation through the entire building, which doesn't have anything to do with the icicles, but it's just something I thought to add. But yeah, we'll see.
But you have calculated exactly where the icicle will fall, and
I have a pretty good idea, you know, and I could always add, you know, right now this is roofed, and this is not. So these roofs are done, and this is not, and what we see is like the kind of curling, know, how the snow kind of curls because it's uninsulated underneath. It may change once it's insulated underneath, but right now it's just freezing and thawing from both sides. And so it kind of just creates these little ice waves that tend to drop pretty much straight below, which an icicle does tend to do. An accelerated slough can definitely gain a little bit of distance from the building, but it's only like 6 feet. So my hope is, and then I'm using polycarbonate across the top, which you can't break with a baseball bat. Not that I really want like icicles landing on it, but I do want some accelerated movement of snow because I want the snow to slough off so that the only shoveling I need to do is here. And I'd rather not be driving on what will be garden beds, but I might even like be able to come in here with a snow plow so that there's always room for snow to slough so that the greenhouse itself isn't like bearing the weight of snow. And in the case of my high tunnel, I had to move all of the plants and stuff around it that I had planted because I snow plow both sides of it so that there's always room for snow to slough. So I'm not out there like trying to rake snow off the top. Elizabeth?
Just had a question about the molding toilet.
Yeah.
Code up there?
Yeah, that's a great question. So anywhere in Vermont anyway, there's nothing coding against compost toilets, moldering toilets. You can do whatever you want to do. However, you need to have the septic capacity. So as long as you have the septic capacity, or a septic system designed or on file or ideally built, I think if you really want to get to the nuance of the code, it needs to be built.
Right. I was just worrying more about floodplain.
Yeah, so floodplain with that, I feel like this is, so first of all, when it floods, they shut down the wastewater treatment facility and the entire sewer system is going directly into the river. And having a concrete sealed vault is, I think, better than like accelerated sewer systems like direct released into the river. So I feel like we can make the case that we exceed the spirit of the law if we don't necessarily meet the letter of the law. But then technically where the building isn't floodplain, but given the, from a legal standpoint, it's not in floodplain, but given the reality of increasing severe storms and increasing apparent frequency of 500-year floods, I'm designing for that to potentially happen. But yeah, I mean, I might get a little water lapping up against my vault, but I wouldn't see any like solid materials floating away because it's closed.
I'm just thinking about washing away.
Yeah, I mean, it's closed in a concrete vault, so
Not even the whole thing.
the whole building. No, not worried about that at all. Yeah, but that's again by design, and that's again why. So another piece, this little stem wall here is actually with this retaining wall is like in the worst case scenario flood, it creates like a total current break around. It's actually curved. It's not square like that. The greenhouse foundation is square, but the retaining wall is curved, and it's like only in the 500-year floods, which fortunately I had the opportunity to observe 2 of last year. The current shifts, and it's not like we're in the river, we're in like kind of a backwater eddy. But anyway, I'm diverting all flotsam and current like totally around my infrastructure, which fortunately I was put to the test and I got to see last year, and my greenhouse was protected and my fruit trees and nut trees were protected, and like, the system worked as designed. So I'm not exactly like cheering on like increasing more 500-year floods, but it's if there's no other plus to it, it certainly shifted the conversation where I have a lot more farmers coming and looking at like our tree crops and looking at our riparian flood design because they had their shit washed away,
And do you have a septic installed?
No, and that's the other little technicality is we don't actually have running water. We have an irrigation system. Sometimes we stand between it and drink from it, and it goes through sinks and we wash dishes in it. But it's technically, we don't have a well, we don't have winterized water yet. So as we winterize buildings, if we dig a well, I might have to put in a septic system. But right now we have a seasonal, and we fall under the same code designation as a deer camp would, which all the old boys on the town hall have their deer camps with their who knows what kind of outhouses. And so as long as we're in the same kind of like legal designation as them, we're comfortable. And we'll see as we get more infrastructure in place. But our irrigation system is a nice hot shower, and you know, but that's another story. But it's a good question to ask, for sure. Any other questions on either of these? So I think, I'm not sure what else, do you have stuff you wanted to do before lunch, Dave, or?
Not before, no.
Do folks need to, maybe we'll spend another, and they said that lunch isn't going to be to 12:30, I don't know if anybody heard that. Heidi just said there's a group coming, so if your stomachs are rumbling, you can grab a snack. But what I might do is segue to unheated winter production in freestanding greenhouses, if that's something you guys would like to hear a little bit about before lunch. Yeah? Okay. So this is, maybe I should talk about it in principle a little bit first. So all of the benefits of attached greenhouses aside, fact of the matter is, from a purely food production standpoint, there's tremendous benefits to freestanding greenhouses. And all of the potential for thermal mass and insulation and gray water recirculation, and all of that is fine, awesome, and cool. But a number of growers have increasingly been asking the question, but why, if not necessary? If it's not necessary, why? And only if you're trying to ripen tomatoes, or if you're trying to ripen figs or lemons or limes, would you really even need to look at heating a greenhouse at all. Elliot Coleman has been one of the main pioneers of this in the Northeast, and essentially what he's doing is unheated production of food in greenhouses during winter months. He calls it farming the backside of the calendar. And it's a nuance. It's technically a little bit of a play on words, because technically we're not really growing food through the winter. We have sustained harvest of live plants through the winter, right? And so in its simplest, what it means is planting out super cold tolerant crops like spinach, mosh, and claytonia are really the ones that are right at the top of the list for most producers. But you can also do leeks, you can also do baby carrots, you can also do baby beets. And planting them as early as now, first week in August. And by November, December, you've got mature plants with established roots that can be cropped, cut and come again, right through November, December, January. And by the time it's February, you can start sowing seed again already. Right? So there's a bunch of different ways you can do this. Obviously, we're talking about putting them in a greenhouse. And then most systems in really cold climates are also putting things under remay or row cover or agricultural spun bonded fabrics, right? Remay and Agribond are the common brand names. Most people call it remay. Each of these is basically giving you a hardiness zone up from where you would be classically. So if you're, here this is typically considered zone 4. Inside your greenhouse, one layer of plastic is zone 5. Under your remay is zone 6. In zone 6, you can grow spinach outdoors in the winter. In fact, spinach is something like our spring ephemerals. Here in the Northeast, we have all of these flowering plants that come up in the early spring and get all their sun and go through their whole reproductive process before the trees leaf out. Well, spinach and a lot of our winter greens in nature evolved to be winter ephemerals. In warmer climates, where trees are still going dormant, these plants would flourish in the understory and grow in the winter with light frost while there was light, but less light because it was winter, but there was light because the trees were dormant. And that's the evolutionary origins of a lot of the plants that we're looking to. And so basically these plants can freeze. They can't freeze down to like -20 or temperatures that we might see outdoors in Vermont, but they can freeze down to like 27 degrees, 28 degrees, without really suffering any damage or even setback in growth. And that's at night. It might get 27 degrees inside this greenhouse under the remay, And then as soon as the sun comes up the next day, boom, it's 32, 33, 34, 40, 50, 60, 70, full sun midday, 80 degrees in there. And these plants are growing more. So we'll visit one here virtually. This is Joe Bewley, who is a farmer right here in Montpelier, Vermont. He would actually look not to Elliot Coleman as a mentor, but actually, this other guy whose name escapes me, Steve, can't remember, but if you want to know, ask me later, I'll remember. But anyway, one of these guys in Pennsylvania who's been mastering winter production in Pennsylvania. So anyway, here we are, snowing outside. This photo was taken early March. It was a snowstorm. There's 2 feet of snow outside. We're in the greenhouse, and this is his fertility system. This is not in his greenhouse. This is next door outside, but he does all his own compost production, and that's the main reason he keeps hens, is for bedding for his soils. Okay, we're going to peel back this rime here, the agribond, and here's what we've got. Spinach, salad, greens, growing, that he cuts and comes again. That's a mixed greens greenhouse. This is the spinach greenhouse. And this is a 30 by 96 high tunnel. In his spinach greenhouse alone, one 30 by 96 high tunnel, he does 800 pounds of spinach a week with no heat. And during November to April, he's selling that at twice the rate that he sells it during the summer, and cannot produce enough of it. Restaurants, you know, the Intervale Food Hub, everybody's buying up as much as they can because people still have the habit of eating salad and greens all winter long, but you know, want to eat local, want to buy local, and he's cranky. Something to be said about Joe and Joe's model is that Joe Bewley is a chef first and foremost, turned to a NECI instructor, a culinary institute, like chef, professor, turned to farmer. And so his model as a grower is direct to restaurants, knowing what chefs buy and buy a lot of, and knowing what they spend money on. And he's sitting there, he's like, I could grow anything. There's 1,000 different things I could grow, but I'm looking at the numbers, and I'm growing the stuff that's actually making me money, which is something that more growers need to hear, you know? Because a lot of these diversified farms, if you really look at the numbers, and I have nothing against diversified farms, but from an economic sustainability standpoint, if you look at the numbers, half of this cool stuff that fills out the diversity of a CSA is stuff that they're losing money on when it really comes down to it. And there's very few things that they're actually like banking on. And I think it's an important conversation for us to start having.
So does he pull the rime off every day?
No, he pretty much leaves it on except for when he's harvesting. I guess if it was getting really hot, he would pull it, or if he was getting like not enough sun over a few days, like cloudy days, and it seemed like there was stress in his plants because of it, he might try to get that much more direct solar gain. But yeah, so this one house is all spinach. The other one is like Claytonia, which is a super hardy winter green. Mâche, which is a French delicacy green, and those are mostly what he's doing. Now, there's another little innovation upon this system. Joe is actually using stationary greenhouses, and so he just built a third greenhouse, which is his starts. And so he's got all his starts going, because he's growing in the summer, tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, cucumbers, whatever. And then he's trying to transplant this stuff in there after he's done with his tomatoes. And you can see that gets tricky, because in a greenhouse, your tomatoes are still going well into the time when you need to have your spinach started and established, especially if you're starting and establishing your spinach in first week of August, right? So one of Elliot Coleman's innovations has been the moving greenhouse. And traditionally, historically, in greenhouses, as we mentioned earlier, there's a buildup of pests and diseases unique to soils that have been in greenhouse management. And especially, you know, in a lot of commercial farms, your greenhouses are pretty much in one crop all the time, like tomatoes or cucumbers or whatever. And the best thing you can do is just bring in some compost to amend that soil with, right? But you end up over time with